August of 1824, a Wiradjuri leader named Windradyne walked into Parramatta with a large group of his people for an annual feast day gathering. On his head, he wore a piece of paper attached to his hat with 2 words written on it in English: Peace, Windradyne. He'd been declared an outlaw. There was a reward on his head. He'd spent months at the centre of one of the most sustained campaigns of Aboriginal resistance in the history of New South Wales, while the colonial government of the time responded with soldiers, martial law, and what one contemporary account described as an order to shoot, to kill any Aboriginal person found anywhere in a vast stretch of country west of the Blue Mountains. And now he was walking into the colony's biggest public gathering with his name and the word peace on his hat, turning himself in on his own terms, in front of the maximum possible audience. It is, as acts of political theatre go, pretty hard to top. Welcome to Truth Be Told, Stories from Black Australia. This podcast is recorded on Wiradjuri country, and we acknowledge the Wiradjuri people as the traditional custodians of the land this show is made on. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present. We extend that respect to all traditional custodians across the lands and to any First Nations peoples listening. Today we're talking about Windradyne, the Wiradjuri warrior who led resistance against the colonial expansion around Bathurst from the early 1820s, the Bathurst War he helped shape, and how the man who survived both martial law and a massacre ended up walking through the gates at Parramatta with his name on his hat. Quick note before we keep going. This episode discusses colonial warfare and massacres, including the killing of women and children. Take care of yourself while you listen. If anything in this brings something up for you, 13 Yarn is a crisis line run entirely by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people any hour of the day or night on 13 92 76. Alright, let's go back to whose country this actually was and what was happening to it. The Wiradjuri Nation is the largest Aboriginal nation in New South Wales, with country stretching across a vast expanse of inland New South Wales along the Macquarie, Lachlan and Murrumbidgee river systems. The Wiradjuri had lived on and managed that country for at least 40,000 years before the British arrived, with a sophisticated understanding of its waterways, its seasonal food cycles, and its governance that colonists arriving in the early 19th century had absolutely no interest in understanding on its own terms. The Bathurst region, or more precisely, the Wiradjuri country around the Macquarie River on the western slopes of the Blue Mountains, was some of the most fertile land in the whole colony, and by the early 1810s, farmers and squatters were pushing into it rapidly after Gregory Blaxland's crossing of the mountains in 1813. The conflict that followed built gradually. Settlers took the best river flats, directly displacing the food sources and access to water Wiradjuri communities depended on. Wiradjuri people responded by spearing cattle, raiding farms, and making the cost of occupying that land as high as they could. Settlers retaliated with their own violence, including several documented incidents of poisoning, a pattern this show has now encountered in Victoria, Queensland, and here in New South Wales at different points in the same colonial period. By 1820, low-level frontier conflict was already ongoing across a wide area west of the mountains, and Windradyne had emerged as one of its most significant Wiradjuri organising figures. Windradyne's early life is largely undocumented in colonial records, which is to say the usual thing applies. We know considerably more about the colonial officials who opposed him than we do about who he actually was before he became their problem. He's known to have been a senior Wiradjuri man, respected within his own community's law, and by multiple colonial accounts, a physically imposing and tactically intelligent leader. He's described in some accounts as being around 30 during the peak conflict years, which would make him born around 1790, a generation that grew up watching the slow transformation of their own country into someone else's pastoral property. Things escalated significantly in 1822, with Wiradjuri attacks on settlers and farms becoming more sustained and more organised across the Bathurst district. In December of that year, in response to ongoing conflict, Governor Thomas Brisbane, who'd replaced Macquarie the previous year, visited the region personally. Rather than negotiating or restraining settler violence, Brisbane's visit essentially signalled to the district's settlers that the government stood behind their expansion and their right to defend it. The following year, 1823, saw a sharp increase in violence on both sides, including the killing of several settlers and the beginning of a sustained military response by the colony. On the 14th of August, 1824, Governor Brisbane declared martial law across the Bathurst district, the second declaration of martial law against Aboriginal people in New South Wales, after Macquarie's own proclamation over the Cumberland Plain 8 years earlier. The practical effect was to authorise soldiers and settlers to shoot Aboriginal people on sight across an enormous area of Wiradjuri country, without the legal requirement for any specific provocation beyond simply being Aboriginal and present. It was a formal declaration of open season on an entire people. What followed over the next few months included some of the worst atrocities of any frontier conflict in New South Wales. Military detachments moved through Wiradjuri country, killing people at multiple locations. One account from a settler who witnessed part of this campaign described soldiers shooting down a group of Aboriginal people, including women, at a location near Bathurst. An estimate often cited in historical accounts puts the number of Wiradjuri people killed across the martial law period at somewhere between 100 and 150, though like almost every death toll from this period, the actual number was probably higher and is almost certainly impossible to precisely determine from surviving records. Some accounts suggest a significant incident at Bells Falls Gorge, near what's now Bathurst, in which Aboriginal people were pushed or driven off a cliff by soldiers, echoing almost exactly the methods used at the Appin massacre 8 years before, under Macquarie's written orders, and at least one documented incident in Tasmania. Research into what happened at Bells Falls continues, with considerable archival evidence that an incident occurred there and that it was serious, though the exact nature and scale is still being investigated by historians, including members of the Colonial Frontier Massacres Research Project at the University of Newcastle. What's clear is that across the whole martial law period, the violence was organised, sustained, and officially sanctioned in a way almost no other frontier conflict in New South Wales had been, with soldiers operating under explicit authority to shoot without the normal legal constraints. On the colonial side, somewhere between 8 and 14 settlers died during the conflict years, by most estimates, a number that does real justice to the scale of organised Wiradjuri resistance, even against soldiers with firearms. The exchange rate was brutally lopsided, but the Wiradjuri made the colony pay as high a price as they could. Martial law was lifted in December of 1824, around the same time Windradyne made his famous walk into the Parramatta feast day, an annual event at which Aboriginal people from across the region were traditionally given the opportunity to come in and receive food from the colonial administration as a form of managed relationship. His decision to present himself there under his own name and under the word peace was not a surrender in any conventional military sense. He was demonstrating, in a way the entire colony could see, that he came in on his own terms, not because he'd been captured or broken, and that the peace being offered was his to give or withhold, not something that had been taken from him. Several colonial accounts describe him being received with what passed, in that context, for cordiality, with observers noting that his very public presentation of himself essentially made it politically difficult to arrest or punish him there, since doing so would have transformed a peace gesture into a public demonstration that the colony wasn't interested in one in front of its own settlers. He wasn't charged with anything. He was allowed to return to Wiradjuri country. It was, as political calculations go, a remarkably clear-eyed piece of manoeuvring by a man operating in a language and a political system not his own, with his life formally on the line while he did it. The years that followed were difficult ones for Windradyne, and for the Wiradjuri more broadly. Martial law had ended, but the dispossession driving the conflict in the first place had not. The government moved to establish a reservation system to contain Wiradjuri communities, and the same pattern we've seen elsewhere began to unfold across the district. Traditional food sources destroyed, movement restricted, communities pushed onto smaller and smaller patches of land. Windradyne himself is believed to have died around 1829 or 1830, only a few years after his famous appearance at Parramatta, from wounds or illness sustained in the years of conflict. Despite dying at perhaps 40 years old at most, having achieved nothing like the formal victory his people deserved, Windradyne left a genuine mark on how Australian history has remembered Wiradjuri resistance. Partly this is due to the extraordinary quality of that single public gesture, the note on the hat, that sits in the historical record as a clear, deliberate act of political communication that needed no translation. Partly it's because Wiradjuri people and their descendants have spent the generations since actively maintaining his memory, ensuring he didn't disappear into the colonial record the way so many resistance leaders of his era did. His name now sits on streets and institutions in the Bathurst district, though, as with most such recognition across the country, that naming came late and without anything like the full truth telling about what he'd actually been resisting attached to it. The Bathurst War itself sits in a strange place in Australian historical consciousness. It's better documented than plenty of frontier conflicts we've covered on this show, partly because the region around Bathurst was close enough to Sydney that journalists and observers were reporting on it in real time, and partly because the martial law proclamation forced things into official record in a way that most colonial violence never did. But it's also been consistently framed, including in much of the academic literature, primarily as a narrative about colonial settlement and its difficulties, with Windradyne and the Wiradjuri appearing mostly as obstacles to that settlement rather than as people with sovereign rights over their own country who were using the means available to them to defend it. Today, the Wiradjuri Nation remains one of the largest and most active Aboriginal nations in New South Wales, with a significant community-led language revival program that has brought Wiradjuri back into schools and daily life across the region. Wiradjuri community organisations operating from Bathurst, Orange, Young and Wagga Wagga, and a sustained effort to tell this history on Wiradjuri terms rather than the colonial ones it's mostly been filtered through for the past 2 centuries. Wiradjuri scholar Jacqueline Troy and others have worked specifically to ensure that the Bathurst War is understood as a genuine war, with a genuine resistance movement, rather than as a series of criminal incidents or a law and order problem, which is the framing much of the 19th century record preferred. So that's where we'll leave it for this one. A man who spent 2 years organising one of the most sustained campaigns of Aboriginal resistance in colonial New South Wales survived a martial law declaration designed specifically to let soldiers shoot him on sight, and walked into a public gathering with his name and the word peace on his hat to end it on his own terms. A colonial government that declared martial law over an entire people's country and authorised open shooting, then lifted it when the politics made holding it untenable. A death toll on the Wiradjuri side estimated in the hundreds against a settler toll in the teens, with the dispossession that caused the whole conflict continuing unchanged once the shooting stopped, and a leader who died at around 40, having won nothing formal, but having left the clearest possible demonstration that the Wiradjuri had not consented to any of it, and would not pretend otherwise even when walking into the heart of the colony to say so. The note on the hat says almost everything. 2 words, his name first, then the offer. In that order, deliberately. Not peace, Windradyne, as though he were agreeing to be managed. Windradyne, peace, as though peace were something he was bringing with him from outside the colony's walls, to lay at its feet on his own terms. If something in this one is sitting with you, let it sit for a minute before you reach for the next distraction. That discomfort is doing something useful. Thanks for listening to Truth Be Told. This has been a 3 Brothers production. I'll see you next time.